I'm very glad to be here in the middle of so much richness of experience and so many, a bouquet of practices, as it were. Thank you so much for being part of it. And I want to thank all of you for coming here. You know, if one was to actually launch into a discussion on a subject that's as completely complex as teaching and learning by taking recourse to a really old play that came out in the 1960s, written by Edward Albee, which became a very popular film as well, just sort of twisting the words. Who's afraid of pedagogy with a capital P? And if one was to actually sort of twin it with another very important title from a very popular TV series, Whose Pedagogy Is It Anyway? You know, from Whose Line Is It Anyway? Which was very popular in the 1990s. One would actually get a sense of how the practice of teaching and learning has grown contrarily over the years. You know, there is a sense of ownership, there's a sense of authority, but also a sense of casualness and carelessness that one associates with this act. So the responses to pedagogy have been, again, very contrary. There's something that's very heartening and something that's very disconcerting at much the same time. There's also a sense of fear, there's also a sense of anxiety that one associates with and progressively so in these days, where the textbook has become such an important site for remodeling history. There's also a sense of hope and enthusiasm, of course, because pedagogy as a whole complex of practices can actually lead to a more enabling understanding of who we are and what we stand for and what our futures are collectively. But also for equity and diversity and also of a certain very interesting layering of thought, which can then be sort of lent to the very act of translating into different kinds of acts, which can alter our social fabric and landscape more equitably, ethically, and empathically. You know, so it has so much. It's a whole fund. It's a whole font of possibilities. I myself am a part of a team that is trying to explore new ways in which art history, art criticism, and most importantly, different kinds of art practices can be explored at the Dr. Shantilal K. Somaya School of Art in Bombay, where the accent will be not only an intersectionality, the way we have come to appreciate it, but also a kind of a sort of cross-fertilization of disciplines and languages and critical approaches, which I think would be quite interesting. We'll get to know more about the challenges as we move ahead, of course. Now, as we sit here on the cusp of all these different contradictory sort of currents and cross-currents, one of the questions that really sort of strikes me bang in the plexus, as it were, is how do we actually expand the conventional definition of pedagogy? How do we sharpen its critical interface, and how do we deepen its inclusivity content? I turn to all of you now. How do your practices, diverse as they are, address this crying need? And what are the challenges involved? Anurag?
Yeah. So where do we start from? Sorry. From my practice. Okay. So I deal with two medium. One is the video diary format, and the other one is the podcast. And in which the podcast, I think, is more of a quote-unquote educational in that sense. But my challenge in that whole thing is to make it interesting. Because if you take away that anxiety of the heaviness, then more people can join in. So you have to give people illusion of lightness, which I think I try to give my podcast. So there are many heavy themes which are discussed, but they are discussed in a manner that they don't scare you, so you can join in. So that has been one of the challenges I face as a creator, as an educator, to how to bring in people in that whole domain of attention economy without being clickbaity or without being didactic. So how to manage these two things, like, so that I don't have to do podcast on naked yatis or in Himalayas or something like that. so I have to also get the audience, but also give them something meaningful. So that has been one of the challenges, and so far I think I have been, to some extent, been successful in getting that particular interest in my work. So yeah, so that is like briefly I wanted to talk about.
Sarovar?
So, thanks Abhay and Shaleen and everybody in your team for putting this together. And for me, I have been teaching in architecture, design, and I have also taught art school students for about 10 years now. And I am not an artist, I'm not an architect, and I'm not a designer. So my interface actually started with my research work on anthropology and architecture and philosophy, which is also one of my core disciplines. And I have over the years taught ideas of politics, ideas which are philosophical and theoretical ideas, because you can't only talk of politics in itself today. So you have to bring in a way of seeing for students, which is about asymmetries, inconsistencies, which is about how the world is not as perfect as it may look on your Instagram reel. And the provocations, though, are located in ideas of understanding sociological notions of the world. I trespass and use, or I would not say trespass, the world of art, the world, we've had so many different genres of art in India. Also, at the end of the day, we are a country where there are very clear distinctions of what is art in the modernity and what is craft. Craft is usually tackled in design schools as a method of making, so which kind of pulls it away from its social contexts, which are of course located in caste, in poverty, in survival. So how does one begin to integrate ways of reading the world around us with ideas of materials and making? So if you're doing a materials and making studio, you have to bring in, so I did teach a studio once on Marx, but I had taken the students to a brick kiln. So how do you unpack very theoretical ideas? I mean, in a sense, what Anurag was saying earlier, what he does for the world, I have to try and do it at the level of the classroom. So I have to integrate continuously. Actually, one lands up innovating, thinking about ideas of capital, politics, communalization of the public sphere. And I'll go into more of this as we proceed in this. But yeah, I don't want to hog the mic because I'm a teacher, so I have a tendency to just go on.
Thanks. Like Sarovar, I'm also a pretender in that I run something called Design Beku. Beku is Kannada for I want, so I want design. But I am not a designer, and I'm a lapsed academic. And by a lapsed academic, what I mean is that I was teaching in the design school context till 2018. At which point I realized that two things. One is that the way that design is taught in this country is profoundly apolitical. So that was something that I really wanted to address. And secondly, so my home discipline is something called digital humanities, which is basically the way that computational and digital kind of developments affect the way that we do humanities and social science research. And I realized that the people who were receiving that knowledge from me, who were the students at Srishti, which is where I was based, who were from very, very elite backgrounds, were not the people who needed that knowledge that much, which is why I founded Design Beku. So the reasoning behind kind of thinking this way was that with digital developments in India, it's obvious that everybody is now part of this kind of huge digital economy, and everyone is being forced into being on a mobile or being digitally engaged in some way or the other. Even citizenship is now profoundly embedded with the digital. The risks of using the digital are profound, and we don't talk about them enough. And while, of course, this is knowledge that should be available to everybody, I kind of felt that it's much easier for somebody who is elite and English speaking to find out about these things, whereas this conversation does not reach people who don't speak or read English, who are low literacy. And so therefore, I kind of look at the work that we do at Design Beku more about advocacy, kind of advocating for a certain kind of critique of technology, and then based in that knowledge, hopefully helping people to self-advocate for themselves. So if they are aware of, the pitfalls of surveillance, then they are kind of more equipped to address it, more equipped to kind of respond to it. So I do think, I don't know whether I would say this is a pedagogical exercise, but it is an educational exercise. But I kind of feel it's more about sharing knowledge, because the other thing that we truly believe at Beku is that the people that we work with are the experts in their own experience or their own lived experience, and they are much better equipped and much more capable than us to respond to the problems that they might be encountering, what are known as wicked problems, I guess. But what we can do is maybe kind of introduce them to ideas that underpin technology that can help maybe subvert some dominant ideas of tech, and push against it, which requires a certain kind of knowledge, a certain kind of also infrastructure. So another core principle that we have at Design Beku is something that we call infrastructuring as a meme. So by this, what we mean is pushing against this idea that technology must be delivered at scale, right? So if I'm coming up with some kind of technological solution or intervention, we're not necessarily saying that that should be delivered at scale for everybody. What we're saying is you can take some aspects of that and then put it elsewhere, but allow its local context, its hyperlocal contours, linguistic context to shape how that technology is delivered. So I feel that when we're talking about pedagogy, pedagogy, the word itself, is so imbued with the idea of power. And we're trying really hard to kind of dissipate that kind of power differential when it comes to sharing knowledge, rather than knowledge coming down from a sage on a stage, and kind of make it more equitable.
Jasmine?
Well, I suppose for me, I am no longer a full-time or even part-time faculty in the academy, whether that be art history or art making practice, although I still engage as a sort of visiting scholar, visiting critic, frequently with the purpose of decolonizing within a very specific context, within a very specific American lineage, and to some extent global lineage, as a way to, I think, create a space of multi-centricity in the way that we think about art and art making, and also art politics. But outside of that sort of more formal academic space, I'm really interested in the ways in which we can work towards demystifying and sort of removing sort of the elitist shroud from art practice by having conversations outside of academic spaces, outside of art spaces, and having conversations with people, again, sort of particularly in the United States, around the ways in which art can change our understanding of social movement and social practice by moving outside of the traditional white box space, although I do work, our main spaces are white box spaces, but creating a space for dialogue and conversation by actually going into publics that are not, I heard a voice, that are not sort of necessarily traditional elitist art viewing spaces or, tier 1 art cities. And that includes everything from being in places like Newark, New Jersey, or in more heavily immigrant spaces within the New York area, or most recently we did a project where we put an exhibition inside of a box truck and we drove it across the United States over 4 months in parallel to the lead up to the American presidential election. And so I know it seems like a millennia ago that we lived in a different world, and now we're in a place where we can't actually say the word woman in an art context without getting in trouble. But yes, my interest really is, I think, in taking the idea of what art education is out of the academy and, for lack of a better term, Robin Hooding it in some way so that it is, in fact, accessible, because I perhaps naively believe that art, design, literature actually can have an impact on people broadly. It's just that we have been trained socially to either take them for granted or to see them as elitist practices.
Sure. Super. If one was to actually sort of abstract some takeaway expressions in the form of keywords, in the discussion that we've had so far, one would sort of arrive maybe at expressions like hierarchies, power, provocations, and politics, right? So I was just curious, given the fact that there is such a range that the four of you actually represent, mobile art and curated shows, you have digital interfaces, podcasts, the classroom and beyond. I'm just wondering about this very difficult proposition, and please feel free to answer it the way you want to, which is how public is the private classroom and how private is the public podcast or the public interface, whether it's a show, which is a semi-private proposition. And I ask this because, of the pressure that all of us feel, increasingly so, and the necessity probably of being tactical all the time, or being strategic all the time, given the pandemic of public hurt and these drummed up or bogus or maybe real offenses that often completely overwhelm attempts to produce, process, and, for want of a better word, consume knowledge. Can one, in some ways, through our practice, create models which can encourage criticality and contrariness as against conformity, which seems to be the goal of several sort of examination-focused models of learning and teaching?
Regarding this whole politics of the hurt and offense and everything, I think that's very natural. Like, whatever you create will offend somebody. So this has been the case, like, for me since last 5 years. Everything is offending somebody. So, which is okay.
That means you're doing it right.
I don't know, but yeah, people are offended. But, so...
Tell us about some stuff that has offended people.
Ashoka University video, I mean... Ashoka invited me and I made a video on Ashoka. So, yeah, just one example. There are many. So, but it's okay. Like, so the main thing is about this whole idea of the offense is that we draw a very clear boundary. Like there are people with us and there is an ideology which is opposite of us. But the thing about the offense is that many times, I think most of the time, the people who think are within your, circle will also be offended by what you do. So the main thing is that you don't try at least not to play to the gallery, and don't keep the whole idea of emotion as very sacred, and try not to please even people who you think are within your territories. So that has been one of the challenging aspects for me, like how to navigate this particular thing, because there are lot many times the people so there are lot many times the people that video is part of something else. Maybe in the next question so that thing I have to navigate, like how to do that, because if I just conform to the emotions of people who are supporting me or people who are quote unquote my admirer, then I don't think I'm doing my job properly. It's not just about offending the other side.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Sarovar?
So, this question you said about how public is the private classroom. I mean, I think one has to think of the classroom as something which is a generative space in the classical sense of a classroom, whether it is in a public university, a private university, or it is as a lot of our classrooms used to be, which is at the chai shop, or, those spaces have, of course, entirely shrunk because the architectures of buildings is such that you do not have corners, and you have what are called, and I don't know if some students from my university are there, but there used to be this thing called the Adda, which was made by the university for students to hang out. And one of the classes that we used to do is to count the surveillance cameras around that. So we're in dark times and under surveillance. And the surveillance is not just external, it's also internal, because, and as somebody who teaches, for me, it is at least being able to show them that the camera has gone inside you. So I have to make them dark existentialists, basically. So that point, to be able to enter a space of the classroom, of the psyche, is what I think land up doing. Also, to be able to talk about religion, caste, violence, to talk about all the different forms of violence that, in a sense, a new generation is growing up with, in a sense which is normalized around them. Like, I teach children who are mostly, calling them children, I teach young adults from the age 18 and 22, most of whom were born between 2000, 2006 or 5, and actually one of them is here. And he's done some interesting work. And there is no sense of a memory even of what went on in just 10 years before they were born, or 7 years before they were born. Like, I do land up screening this film called Ram Ke Naam, which is about the Babri demolition, and I've done it for 7 years in a row. It means a certain kind of a risk at some level right now, which is what our world has become, or our country has become. But there's a way that one can navigate this. There's also a form of trust you start building with students. And different, I'm saying this right now, but I have colleagues and friends who teach in all kinds of different places, and there has been serious action taken on them for showing anything that is against current regimes in power. So, but I think as somebody who teaches, it's very important for me to be able to make them see it themselves. So So if I open out a set of questions, if I open out a set of ideas of what is this notion of identity, identity politics, what is the forms of the nation that you are going to inhabit or are currently inhabiting, and this thing is also about the futures. The future is here and it's very dark. So, and you should be able to see that and discern it and maybe, grow up to become someone who's a little bit more aware and conscious of these things or resist it. Yeah. So that's, I think, wow, I don't know how I said that.
I think, a lot of the stuff that Sarovar says kind of rings true. And very sadly, the kind of examples of this kind of surveillance and interference also extends to school education. So some work we did under a project called Gendering the Smart City with Ayona Datta, who's an urban geographer. We were looking at the delivery or the lack thereof of services during the pandemic that should have been delivered by state and central governments, but were often not. And therefore, civil society and NGOs and CBOs had to step in and did a fantastic job. And at this point, we interviewed many people whose children were forced to go online to kind of avail of education. And of course, by the very virtue of them going online, they were immediately part of surveillance regimes, which were often built into things like learning environments. And this is now absolutely, this is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. We're seeing this as soon as your child is kind of part of any kind of learning platform, their data is being collected. Which is terrifying, and parents are not empowered enough to say no, to push against it, because you become persona non grata as soon as you decide not to be digital, and that is a terrible kind of indictment of the times that we live in. On the other hand, we run something called the Digital Everyday, along with Point of View, which is a feminist NGO based in Bombay, and the Digital Narrative Studio, which is in Hong Kong, which is basically an online school. It's a 3-month school on gender, technology, and social change. And it's been running for 3 years now. I think in the last cohort, we had around 110 students from all over the world. And so that is obviously, you're attending online, everything is online. There are opportunities to meet in person. But the big difference, of course, is that that's consensual, right? Like there's a opting in to being part of these digital environments. And obviously, when we are doing these courses, we try very hard to use technologies that don't collect data and, kind of do them, ethically. So I think the kind of, and it's quite ironic to me, and it doesn't escape me that as somebody who is so informed and invested in technology, that our own work at Design Beku is very under the radar. We have terrible social media presence, and we try not to be promoted by the algorithm a lot of the time because there's work that we don't want to share far outside the localities that we're doing them in, because visibility does mean vulnerability for many of the communities that we work with, and we don't want to put them at risk. So it's a very fine balance. And it's something that I wish we didn't have to, continually contend with. But this is the reality of the world we're in.
Jasmine.
Remind me of the question, the original question.
The sort of ways in which different sort of propositions intertwine, privacy and sort of the public sphere and the private sphere, and what ensues when you have different kinds of pressures that make these walls very porous.
I don't know if I have a good answer for you, because I feel like things for me in the context and the geography in which I'm living are changing so rapidly. So if you had asked me 3 weeks ago, I would say I try my hardest to break down
That's a crazily
the barrier
good answer, really.
between public and private, right? And make everything as public as possible, even at the risk of being hyper vulnerable in spaces, because I think that it's very important. And I learned this with a show that I did on reproductive justice maybe right before the pandemic. It's actually more important to me to create community through visible action and public action whether that be small or large. It's all very, publics are relative, as a way to create community and not necessarily to publicly justify the validity of my existence in the world or my community's existence. However, with sort of a very real presence of consequence from surveillance that has changed literally within the past 3 weeks for me, that mode of thinking.
It's continuously scary. But I'm just sort of, again, drawing from the discussion that we've had so far and the pressing need to go beyond traditional modes of addressing ways of being and becoming as teachers, as pedagogues, as information disseminators, if you will. And also, most importantly, the ways in which the roles of the learner and the teacher, the student and the professor are continuously being renegotiated in terms that are both sort of very intimate, but also sort of modeled by the positions and the locations that people occupy. One is very, very aware of the fact that there is a lot of politics and political power that seems to be, affecting and affecting our ways of being and becoming teachers. But I'm also curious about the age of the information overload and the sort of presence of AI in an environment that is rife with what one might call post-truth pollution. How important and how would you choose to factor in, channelize discussions about and also code ethics and empathy in the ways in which you would probably present knowledge, or in the ways in which you would explore through your practice ways of understanding the world around us?
I think for me, who obviously kind of works very closely with technology and how it impacts our lives, I think there are two problems. First of all, the discourse is completely run by corporate technology, right? Like, so for example, a term like responsible AI, quote unquote, that we hear everywhere, it's a paradox, it's an oxymoron, it doesn't exist. And the fact that we fight to support initiatives in quote-unquote responsible AI is just to ensure that business goes as smoothly and as usual, right? So I think that's, like, to my mind, I guess it's a slightly radical standpoint. To my mind, feminist AI means the choice not to use AI, the choice not to kind of, it isn't inevitable. And I think that's something that we're really trying to fight to explain to people. But on the other hand, I think what we also have to ensure is that people understand what we mean when we're talking about technology. I think, so recently we were in Tamil Nadu working with farmers and people who help the farmers collect data. So they have these apps and they have to kind of update these apps with information about the farmers. And I said, have you heard of AI? And one of them said, yeah, artificial insemination, which is a perfectly valid answer. They're farmers. But it just goes to show that, when we're talking to people, to so many people, be that my parents who are in their 70s or be that, farmers in a tier 3 city, that, what is AI? What do we mean when we talk about AI? That knowledge has to be kind of within the grasp of everybody using technology, right? And so what we try to do is to kind of, in a way, echoing Anurag, like through entertaining ways, like video games, films, games, to explain what is data. Like, so when I speak to the people that we work with a lot of the time, and I ask them about data, they think it's something, and they're right, that you buy, right? Like, you buy data for your phone. But they're not thinking of data as, units of information that are being transformed or, kind of being transcended through various networks. So I think like what really worries me is the lack of knowledge and expertise in talking about technology from the very highest echelons of government and corporations to, the user who is, kind of the victim in all of this. So I kind of feel like the moment of AI, of course, comes with many worries, and in India particularly, because India is not equipped for AI. Large language models are trained on languages. So most languages that have robust LLMs are what we call high resource languages. Hindi, which is the most spoken language in this country, comprises 0.5% of the internet, which means that when we're training LLMs, large language models, on Hindi, that alone is incredibly sparse. Now go down to either Shautali or Bhojpuri, it's going to be a disaster, and it already is. So, and then you have, your Googles of the world who are trying to translate search to disastrous results. Like we've done experiments where we've asked people to find out about, where their COVID vaccine, where they can get the COVID vaccine, and they've been pointed to places in America because the US are better at translating these protocols into languages for their immigrants, for their Bengali immigrants, say, than we are here. So, obviously what I'm saying is, it has to be done by many more people than us, that we're a tiny drop in the ocean. So we really want other people to kind of be aware that this is something that has to happen now when it's already too late.
So there are, I think, 3-4 points that you made. The first one was one of the difficulty of teaching this generation, which I faced in my limited teaching period. Like I was teaching at IIM Lucknow, and most of the question was like, "Iska fayda kya hai?" Like, art seekh ke milega kya? Like, what if we fail? I said, art is the process of failing till the very end. So that became very difficult to explain what is the utility of the art in the current world, and especially since everything became algorithmic, and we are all under the grace of the algorithm, praying to the algorithm. Then in that sense, how we create, which is not conforming to the sameness of the algorithm, which is one of the demand that algorithm makes. So that sameness, how we break, is a very difficult point. The second thing is that I think of the work as quote unquote exposing to something. For example, people say our podcast, the replacement of the books. I say it's not, because it's just exposing you to something. Now you can, build upon it, your own knowledge system. So it's not a complete knowledge in itself. So that whole exposing to new things is something I try to do, even in my funny videos. For example, I remember that when I was around 20, 21, I used to read a vlog, Passion for Cinema. I think you might be aware of that. So it was a very, not badly, badly in the sense of the interface and everything, but I learned 2 words from there. Some filmmaker was writing about existentialism and surrealism. And through that, my whole journey of the literature started just by these 2 words, because I started Googling, discovering new filmmaker and everything. So these, throwing some kind of words which may sound pretentious are also very important. So this is something I also try to do with so now we can play a video. So basically I had a very bad sandwich in US. It's called, I think you might, so it's Panera sandwich. So I just used that video to
ये बेहुदा सैंडविच खाने का दुर्भाग्य प्राप्त हुआ। यह सैंडविच इतना ठंडा था कि मुझे इसे खा के जुकाम हो गया। यह सैंडविच इतना हार्ड था कि अमेरिका का मिलिट्री इंडस्ट्रियल कॉम्प्लेक्स इसे बॉम्ब के रूप में यूज करके दूसरे देशों की सरकार भी बदल सकता है। दूसरे देशों में डेमोक्रेसी लाने का ऑफिशियल स्पॉन्सर पनेरा सैंडविच। दुख तब और होता है जब आप अमेरिकी इतिहास को देखते हैं, जहां व्हाइट यूरोपियंस द्वारा नेटिव अमेरिकन को रोंद के यूएस जैसे कंट्री का निर्माण किया गया। इतनी मेहनत और खूनी लड़ाइयों से लैंड छीनने के बाद इन गोरे लोगों ने इस लैंड पे खोला विश्व का सबसे वाहियात सैंडविच स्टोर पनेरा। मेरा ऐसा निजी विचार भी है कि क्रिस्टोफर कोलंबस भी अपनी कब्र में इस गिल्ट के मारे करवटें बदल रहा होगा कि क्या यही दिन देखने के लिए मैंने इस देश को डिस्कवर किया था। सच कहूं तो शायद यहाँ तक भी कहना गलत नहीं होगा कि ये सैंडविच इतना पुराना और ठंडा लग रहा था कि इसे सैंडविचों की दुनिया का जो बाइडेन भी कहा जा सकता है। सैंडविच इतना ठंडा कि खुद बाबा रामदेव ने भी कहा कि पनेरा सैंडविच को गठिया के दर्द कम करने के लिए आइस पैक के रूप में भी यूज किया जा सकता है।
So basically how to use a bad experience into the history of the some
Lovely.
culture and
Absolutely.
something like that. Colonialism and everything. So there is that possibility as well in the humor. And the third last point about the AI is that I work a lot around AI. I'm very interested because I'm a field software engineer and also allegedly an artist. So I'm very interested in what are the possibilities. So I see of the AI is more of a curatorial thing. It's like if you are in that position to choose right and wrong, then AI can be a very interesting tool because you can brainstorm, it can give you new ideas and everything. But if you are starting with the initial level, then I think you will get lost in that sameness that AI is producing. So maybe AI is more synced with that whole Neti philosophy of Indian philosophy in that sense. Yeah.
Thanks, Anurag. Sarovar and Jasmine.
So I want to say something provocative on this AI thing. So as I was mentioning about the classroom and the psyches of young people, I am the AI. That is my counter to AI. Because I think what Anurag was saying, like for me, it's not about existentialism and teaching them a philosophy or Dadaism. It's about that you have your own ways of thinking and seeing the world. Once I ran a course called Thinking with the Islamic 8, Anthropologies and Architectures. And what was interesting was a lot of students took it from all kinds of different schools and law school and public policy. And I found a strange hunger in them to kind of nearly want to know more. It's like now, because courses have become about what you were saying, what is this giving us, what is the productivity idea, what am I learning? It was an experiment. I thought nobody will take that course, and it was full, and the students, I mean, we even, their students, I mean, of course, a whole generation of students and younger people who have never been inside a mosque or a shrine. And I said, you can walk into Jama Masjid in Delhi. We've done that when we were young. Nobody's going to ask you what you're doing there. Just dress a little bit properly. And we actually took a class in one of the side corridors of Jama Masjid. So, one is that how does one start thinking of the counterforce of whatever this virtual world is. Also, I do make students mess up their algorithms on Instagram because I make them follow Alt News, Anurag Minus Verma, Muktub Media. So that you have to do because in the middle of Insta Reels, they should get suddenly all these kind of things. So, I mean, I feel this... the anxiety of AI is probably more, and I think we'll just have to work a little bit harder. That's all. As teachers, yes.
Well, I suppose I don't necessarily encounter AI or these technologies in such a direct way, but similarly to what you're all saying, I think it is a tool that's very useful if it's understood. And it's something that I think, there's a lot of, I take back what I say about not directly being involved with it because it does bring up a lot of questions around ethics of making, ownership, intellectual property, in the context of visual art or any sort of art or culture making. But another thing that I think is very important that you touched on is the understanding of where information is coming that feeds AIs, which is implicitly biased always and predominantly fed through the lens of straight white men and then their conglomerates. And I think it's important, one of the things that we try and do indirectly is host what we call wikithons, right, as one way to feed information, since Wikipedia is still a source of information for a lot of people, by flooding the information that's on those types of sites with information about people like us, particularly through the feminist lens, through information about multiple types of feminisms, Because unless the information is there, algorithms are not picking it up, and then they're not incorporating it into the discourse that AI is spitting out, that we're all eventually, if we're not using it now, will be using as a tool to build.
Sure. Thank you so much. It's been such a provocative discussion, and I mean, some of the areas that we've touched have been about the politics of risk-taking, about navigating diverse knowledge systems, battling biases, counter-provoking prejudices, and sort of generating intimacies and insights in different ways. But I think more than anything else, this has been, to borrow from what Anurag said some time back, it's been about being relentlessly optimistic and being in the throes of giving grace and actually being a font receptacle for acquiring grace. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you all of you.
Thank you.
I really hope this conversation continues even as we move ahead. Thank you.